Good morning, Your Honors. Michael Parietti for the appellants. This case...
Would just like to be... Are you an attorney, or are you arguing this?
Oh, pro se.
Non-attorney, pro se.
Pro se.
Okay.
This case involves a town special election on a ward system for the establishment of a ward system in town of Rampo in September 30 of 2014. The first issue I would like to raise briefly is that of jurisdiction. The lower court and respondents claim that this court has no jurisdiction to set aside the special election. However, if you look at this department's decision in order of June 24, 2015, it clearly states, the authority to invalidate the special election may be exercised by the court in the context of a hybrid proceeding pursuant to CPR Article 78 to review a determination made by the town based on the results of the referendum and action for a declaratory judgment. That's exactly the proceeding that you have here before you today. I also look at the matter of D'Addario v. McNabb. The Court of Appeals, that case also involved a special election for the establishment of a ward system in the town of Brookhaven, New York. And the Court of Appeals said, unfortunately, the proposition was not submitted in the manner required by law. The appellate division nullified the vote on that ground, as it must have done under the applicable statutes and precedents of this court. So I think it's clear that this court has jurisdiction to set aside or nullify the vote.
Okay, so let's get past that for a second and let's get to the nitty-gritty, okay, if I may?
Certainly.
Which is your argument that this special election should be set aside because principally of the non-registered voters that voted in this election, correct?
Well, it's...
Let's say that's one of your arguments.
Well, the main argument is that the language regarding registration...
In what?
In the Town Resolution 214-375 included language regarding voter registration that was not authorized by Town Law Section 82. And Town Law Section 82 is titled Notice of Submission of Proposition Hours of Voting, and it reads, the town board shall adopt a resolution at least 20 days before every special town election designating the hours of opening and closing the polls and the place or places of holding the election and setting forth in full all propositions to be voted upon. All right. It is clear from the wording of Section 82 that the resolution described therein is an integral and mandatory part of the submission process. It includes, Section 82 delineates exactly what information is supposed to be included in that resolution, and it does not authorize information regarding voter registration. Okay? Despite that fact, the town chose to insert the following language: be it further resolved that potentially eligible voters may register to vote at the Rockland County Board of Elections on or before September 23, 2014. Okay. This language is clearly not authorized by Section 82. And therefore, I go back to D'Addario v. McNabb that says the proposition was not submitted in the manner required by law. The appellate division nullified the vote on that ground. So I think that's clear that they violated the mandatory requirements of Section 82. Okay. I'll also point out that the language they included regarding voter registration was confusing, misleading, and false. Okay. But that's a separate issue I will address just a little bit later on.
The statute does permit the town to determine in advance whether or not the voters would have to be only those who were registered, or more expansively, voters who simply reside within the town who could then vote by affidavit ballot.
Correct.
Right? Getting to the facts of the case here, one of your main complaints seems to be that you had a little over 50% on the ballot, machine ballot vote in favor of the referendum.
And the absentees.
And then the absentees, you had even higher percentage in favor of the referendum with the absentees. And then you have this outlier, it seems, of the affidavit ballots being 80% opposed and 20% in favor. And you seem to be extrapolating from that, well therefore, we have to set aside this election. But you also have in your your papers affidavits from various individuals, some of whom witnessed large numbers of individuals from religious communities in the polling places near those religious communities who came out and voted by absentee ballot. And why doesn't that simply explain why, if the religious communities felt it was in their interests to defeat this, they got their people out to the polls, they voted, and that explains the 80%, 20%, which is at odds with the machine ballot and the absentee ballots.
Well, I would agree with you if they had not inserted that misleading language regarding voter registration in the resolution described in Section 82. Because if you go to, let's go back to Diodero v. McNabb, it says, there must be some definitive legal inception to the electoral process. Publication and notice are not addressed to the general public as a principal matter. They are designed to record the significant political event in a publicly accessible place and to allow those who monitor elections to ascertain the facts. These requirements, in a legal or jurisdictional sense, serve the same function as service of process. Okay? This is a jurisdictional defect. Essentially, the language in that resolution essentially served notice to unregistered voters that they could not vote in the special town election. And we believe, of course we have no evidence of this, but we understand the political dynamic in the town where the Hasidic community monolithically support the supervisor and the town board. They were opposed to the propositions. And I think if you consider the fact that there was high voter interest in this proposition throughout the town, okay? And that is shown that 27,995 registered voters cast their votes in this election, which is the same or even higher than the normal town biennial election, okay? It just strains credibility to believe that there would be a high level of voter interest among registered voters who were against who were in favor of the propositions, but that in the part of the community that was opposed to opposed to these propositions, that you would have high voter interest in registered voters as well as unregistered voters.
Of course, as to those religious voters, and you make some reference in your own papers to this, that vote tends to be monolithic, that
Correct.
You don't have people walking off the street and just deciding, well, I'm going to vote for or against this or that or this person or that person, that community leaders give an indication of how the vote should be so that you end up with a block that votes, and that's going to further skew a result such as an 80-20%.
But not necessarily, because look at the overall voter register, among the registered voters, the people who were in favor of the proposition, it was approved. Okay, and the same with registered voters from the people who were opposed to it, voted, and it was disapproved. And it was roughly like 50 to 49%. Mm-hmm. Then you suddenly take the unregistered voters, the affidavit ballots, and you have this acutely divergent result where it's 80-something% against and less than 20% for. Okay, you got, you go to Ippolito v. Power. It said.
And your argument is, yes, we understand all of that. And we understand how the other side, that would be the other side of your position, actually prevailed. And it was because of the high number of unregistered voters that voted by way of affidavit, correct?
Correct.
That's the reason.
Yes.
Otherwise you would have won.
Right.
What made that illegal?
Well, it's the jurisdictional defect of
That's
these.
what I want to hear again. So what you're saying is that the town of Ramapo passed a town of Ramapo law different than the town law, that is New York State town law, which clearly sets forth that in special proceedings you can have a situation where non-registered voters can vote, correct?
Well, the town has a choice. They can, according to the town law, they can either allow unregistered people to vote, or they can.
Nothing. If they did nothing,
Okay. If
what would happen?
Then
if
unregistered.
The town of Ramapo
If
passes no town law, that is town of Ramapo law, what happens?
Well, then unregistered people.
This limited area.
Unregistered. If they did nothing, if they did not require registration, then unregistered people would be allowed to vote. But in this case, they inserted language in this the resolution described in Section 82, which is an integral and mandatory part of the submission process, that said, in truth, in plain English, it said, if you want to register to vote, if you want to vote in the town special election, you have to register with the Board of Elections on or before September 23rd. Let me...
Never passed a resolution that, in, what was it, Section 84, subsection
Section
2?
80, no, well, the part about personal registration, they did not pass the resolution.
Right.
But they passed...
Confuse the voters, in effect.
Absolutely,
By
they did.
saying that you need to, or that you can register by a certain date.
Well, they said, you know, let's talk about the language specifically. It
You
said-
shall register by a certain date.
No, it said, you may, okay, potentially eligible voters may register with the Board of Elections on or before September 23rd, 2014.
Right.
Okay, now let's look at the actual phraseology they used. Potentially eligible voters, that is ripe with the implication that if you want to vote in the special election and you're potentially eligible, you must take some action to transform yourself into an actually eligible voter, okay? And that action is laid out right in the text after potentially eligible voter. It says, may register at the Board of Elections on or before September 23rd, 2014. The use
That's
of...
a may, right?
Not a
May.
must.
Significant-
May.
Is it significant that it's a may versus a must?
No, because...
That's not significant?
I don't think, because in plain English, if you read that in plain, potentially eligible voters may register at the Board of Elections on or before September 23rd. On or before September 23rd, that is the very strong implication of a deadline where you may register to vote before that deadline, and that you may not, if you don't register by that deadline, you may not vote in the special election. That's what it says in plain English. And that's the way people read it. That's why I understood the
Well, you say that's how people read it. Do we have an affidavit from any voter or potential voter that said, gee, I didn't realize that I could vote by affidavit ballot, and therefore I didn't vote, and if I had known that, and if the town had told me, then I would have shown up and voted?
Well, first of all, it's a jurisdictional defect, okay? Process of service was not affected to unregistered voters in the town. So that, and that's
Yeah,
jurisdictional.
we
Okay,
understand that
okay,
you have a
but-
jurisdictional argument.
right,
Moving
but-
beyond that,
okay,
assuming without
right.
deciding that we get beyond it, do you need factually now to have an affidavit from one or more voters saying, hey, I was misled here, I've been disenfranchised?
Well, I think that's an unreasonable expectation, because think about that. We go around the town and said, hey, come here. If you had known that you could vote in this election...
Well, aren't we
would-
speculating absent that?
Well, let me read you Ippolito v.
Didn't we actually have unregistered voters vote?
Yes, absolutely. We had 2,000 plus unregistered voters vote. The vast majority of those voted against the proposition,
But
which
they
was...
did vote.
Did they vote? Well, they voted by affidavit ballot. Okay. That's how, and that changed the outcome of the election from
The
approval.
affidavit ballot states that they've lived in Ramapo, by and large, I think probably most of them said, that they checked off that middle section, that they've actually lived in Ramapo for the last 30 days.
Well, in actuality, first of all, we're not contesting any of the affidavit ballots that were cast, because that's a very onerous job. So we're not doing that. We don't need to do that because the jurisdictional defect in the town resolution, that is an integral and mandatory part of the submission process, said in plain English that if you wanted to register, if you wanted to vote in the town special, you had to register on or before September 2023.
No,
But-
you may.
May, but in plain English, you know what that means. You may register on or before September 2023. As a matter of fact, that's a false statement.
I
You know what?
may agree with you.
But let me finish one thing, Your Honor. That itself is a false statement, because you know what? They could have voted. They may register anytime after that, too. So it's actually a false statement in two ways. Matter of fact, they may have registered on the 28th, and they still would have been eligible to vote. They may register. It's a false statement in that sense, and in plain English, it's a false statement, because we who are reading these things said, well, this is the way the town's going to do it. They're going to let the Board of Elections handle the registration. We were fine with that. We have more trust in the Board of Elections than we do in the town of Ramapo. But, you know, let me go to Ippolito v. Power is, I think, one of the most important pieces. This is the Court of Appeals, and they say, while it is troubling to require a new election for irregularities without evidence of fraud or other intentional misconduct, ignoring such irregularities would undoubtedly create the likelihood that skillfully manipulated irregularities would be used to mask corrupt practices. It is better to keep the standards high, even at the cost of penalizing some voters and candidates for the failures of election inspectors, than to increase the opportunities for fraud without possibility or likelihood of discovery. And the statute is explicit in directing that irregularities as well as fraud may justify the direction of a new election. The one thing I haven't had a chance to get to is there was an overarching umbrella of interlocking irregularities that I will touch on briefly. Aside, that misleading language in the town resolution laid the foundation for a scheme to influence the outcome of the election. When people made inquiries to the town clerk's office regarding voter registration, and those inquiries were either ignored or responded to with misleading information or false information, and that was because they did not want word of the fact that unregistered voters could get out to the general public. The town also held special training sessions specifically for the town's special election on September 22nd and 23rd. And in those training sessions, the election inspectors were never told, and we have a number of affidavits to that effect, that unregistered voters would be allowed to vote, or what the procedure would be for processing an affidavit ballot by someone who is an unregistered voter.
Quickly interject on that point. Now, what are we to make of the fact that you have a Ms. Ivan who had an affidavit saying that on the morning of the vote she saw in a newspaper an announcement which indicated that you could vote even if you were not registered in the town?
Right. Well, don't you think that you should? As a matter of fact, that gets me to my next irregularity. When the election inspectors showed up at the polls on the morning of the thing, they were given a packet of information. It was called important information. And in that packet, there was no mention of the fact that unregistered voters would be allowed to vote or what the procedure would be for casting an affidavit ballot by an unregistered voter. And the same information made reference to valid registered voters. And we believe the town knew that even at that late date, if word would get out that unregistered voters could vote, that a large number of unregistered voters in favor of the propositions would come out. You know, you have and then the other thing is his point about the affidavit ballot. In fact, the town did not require them to swear the oath that he talks about. The affidavit ballot had 3 different check marks. Only one of those 3 fulfilled the requirement of swearing that you were a qualified elector of the town. The other 2 did not. And they accepted, they said you only have to check one of these 3 boxes, and they accepted these affidavit ballots, which were then put into the canvass, and most of them were counted as valid votes. So the point is, we have an overarching umbrella of these interlocking irregularities that brings us to Ipleopi power, where, you know, once again, we have to look at skillfully manipulated irregularities. The town was openly opposed to the creation of a ward system, but they knew that it had a broad appeal among the electorate. Okay, and just look at, this is an email from Mona Montal, who was the town purchasing director, who played a significant role in the administration of the election. And she says, it's a fundraising email she sent out to raise money to oppose the propositions. Basically, they're trying to kill us, and if I sound like I am nervous and frightened, it's because I am. Even if we all come out against the ward system, they can, in theory, outnumber us. And she goes on to say, the money has been spent on countering their attack in various ethnic and modern Orthodox communities, which both seem to be leaning in the wrong direction on this issue. So they knew that if the voters were allowed to express their will freely at the ballot box, that both of these propositions may very well have passed. And they were afraid of the transparency that that would bring to town hall, so they hatched this scheme to influence the outcome of the election.
We have the argument.
Excuse me?
We have your argument.
Okay, can I make one
Arguments,
further?
plural.
One further, and that
Very,
is...
very quickly, we're beyond our time.
Okay,
Go ahead.
simply that they violated town law section 83 when they failed to conduct the canvass without adjournment. Okay, town law section 83 specifically states that once the special election is done, they will count the votes thereat and continue without adjournment until all the votes are canvassed. They failed to do that. As a matter of fact, this court issued an order on June 24, 2015, which said that, the votes must be counted. As soon as that order came down, the town should have promptly begun the canvass and continued without adjournment. They didn't even begin the canvass until July 29th, more than a month later. And when they did begin the canvass, they did not continue without adjournment. As a matter of fact, they adjourned every night and every weekend. The canvass lasted over 30 days.
And you say that that was to get it beyond when the November elections would have been.
I definitely think that that was part of their plan. It was also, who knows what they were doing, trying to figure out what the vote count was so they could manipulate it. We have an overarching umbrella of irregularities that leads us to Ippolito v. Power. And I would just say, they didn't want the ward system. They hatched a scheme to prevent it. They have used the full legal and financial resources of the town to delay and forestall a vote on the ward system as well as the implementation of it. Please don't reward them for their efforts. They have shown they cannot be trusted to hold a town special election on a ward system. We ask the court to nullify the vote and direct the Ramapo town clerk to transmit a certified copy of the text of the propositions in question to the Rockland County Board of Elections on or before October 2nd, which is 36 days prior to the town biennial election, as per town law, New York State Election Law 4-108, so that the revote can be held on the next town biennial election, so that it will be held under the auspices of the Rockland County Board of Elections and not the town of Ramapo. And the people of Ramapo will finally have a fair say at the ballot box as to whether they want to implement the ward system. Thank you very much.
Mr. Parietti. For a non-lawyer, you were on top of your argument.
Thank you, sir.
May it please the court, my name is Janice Gettleman. I'm a deputy town attorney for the town of Ramapo, representing the town, as well as Christian Sampson, the town clerk.
Seems as if the main, I don't want to really single it down to just one argument, but a main argument here has to do with the language of the resolution and whether or not it was misleading.
Correct. And I think that what appellants have tried to do is to link the language, the objected to language, to an issue of notice. They're trying to link those two items together and take advantage of the holding in D'Addario versus McNabb, which, of course, as the court knows, held that a lack of notice is like a jurisdictional defect which will invalidate an election.
What was the purpose of that resolution?
Well, the resolution itself was statutorily required in order to set the date of the election. It did set the date of the election. It attached to it the required list of polling places. It was passed the appropriate time prior to the election. In addition to that, the town, as it was statutorily required to do, posted the information concerning the
What
election.
I'm referring to, yes, I understand.
Yes.
And then at the end, or somewhere in there, it states quite clearly that you may register for this election up to September 23rd. The election was
Correct.
September 30th, and you may register up to the 23rd.
Correct.
When, in fact, you didn't have to register at all.
You didn't have to register at all if you wanted to
But
vote
isn't
in the
that a
election.
fact? You didn't have to register at all.
Did not have to register at all.
So what was the point?
Because the town was going to be using poll books to check for registered voters. If you were going to come as a registered voter and you wanted to register, you had to do that by a certain date for your name to appear in the poll book. As a matter of fact, the poll books were updated, and in those special instructions provided to the election.
But it really didn't mean
inspectors-
anything, because you didn't have to be registered. And allegedly, busloads of people came from all kinds of places, allegedly, and registered and actually voted when, in fact, they hadn't registered up until that moment. And there were various polling places where they were descended upon by people who were from maybe not the town of Ramapo, and maybe they did live there for the last 30 days, right?
Well, for sure, certain polling places saw a larger turnout of people who had not previously registered at any time in the past, or certainly before September 23rd, and other polling places had smaller amounts of people who
So
were
isn't the
choosing to vote.
September 23rd issue somewhat misleading? And if it isn't misleading, why isn't it misleading?
Well, for sure, the lower court made a determination in both the decisions, the earlier decision and the later decision, that she felt that it potentially could have been misleading. The town does not take that position. We thought that was important information about registration prior to, just to make the process somewhat simpler. But even if you were to take the
Doesn't
position...
it specifically say not less than 1 day in advance?
I'm sorry?
Provided an application is received by the town clerk not less than 1 day in advance?
With that, I think, is that regarding absentee ballots?
Absentee ballot, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was discussing the affidavit
I
ballots.
understand, but I'm asking you about that one now as well. You have these issues coming in.
Well, the appellants are not raising any issues concerning absentee ballots on this appeal, Your Honor. They have, insofar as they carried those votes, they didn't pursue that issue on
But you were
appeal.
specific enough with that one to list that it had to come in 1 day in advance.
Well, that's statutorily required in terms of when the ballot has to come in, so they were following statute with respect to that. Here, there was no requirement for registration, but that language was included. But the town's point is this, Your Honor, that even
So
if...
the question is, since it wasn't statutorily required, why'd you put it in there?
The town made a representation at the earlier hearing before Judge Garvey that it was included in order to give people information concerning when they could register. Whether it was confusing or was not confusing, we submit, is irrelevant on this appeal.
What if somebody came in the 24th and registered? No good.
In the Board of Elections?
What if somebody came in wherever they registered prior to the 23rd, but they came in the 24th, the 25th, the 26th, the 27th to register? Could they register?
They could. I don't know what the Board of Elections would do or would not
It's either
do.
yes or no. Could they register?
It's possible that they could register, and maybe then they're...
But this notice is saying you can't. You may register up until the 23rd.
to be in the poll book
And
for
it
this
may
election.
rain tomorrow. What does it mean?
Well, you could register before that date if you wanted to be in the poll books for this election.
It
as a
doesn't say
registered
that.
voter.
You're saying that. It just says you may register before the 23rd. What happens, I'm asking you, what happens if you come in, you're the town attorney, you come in, I come in the 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th. Can I register?
Your Honor, the registration takes place in the Rockland County Board of Elections, not in the town of Rampo. If an individual had gone to the Rockland County Board of Elections after the 23rd, which was, according to them, the cutoff for being in the poll book, then maybe the Board of Elections would have taken the registration application. Maybe they wouldn't. I can't speak for them. But what I can say was, if that individual went to the polls, they would have been permitted to vote by affidavit ballot, just as if somebody had gone to the polls who represented to the election inspectors, I am registered, even though their name didn't appear in the poll book, they would have been permitted to vote
So
by
it's simply
affidavit
a
ballot.
difference of whether you vote on the machine or whether you vote by
Correct.
affidavit.
Everybody was allowed to vote. The question was it going to be by machine ballot or was it going to be by affidavit ballot? And Your Honor should understand that it's not as if the town of Rampo, or I don't think any town, routinely processes or holds special elections. In fact, the last one was 4 years ago when there was a proposition regarding a stadium, which was clearly not a favorable proposition, and it did not pass. And
Certainly not favorable to certain people.
correct. And it did not pass at that time, and no allegations were made that certain people were tipped off or not tipped off. In fact, it did not go the way that the administration had hoped it had gone at that time. Be that as it may, at that point, there was a very low affidavit voter turnout. And in this instance, the town clerk had no way to foresee that there would be such a large voter turnout, since certainly it didn't happen, and there's no evidence that certain groups in the community were tipped off. And in fact, I think Appellant states that both in his brief and his reply brief, that we have no evidence of this. There's simply no evidence that any particular group was told that there was going to be the availability of affidavit voting, and other groups it was kept a secret from. In fact, there was quite a number of affidavit voting by people who were opposed to the
But what of Mr. Paretti's
referendum.
argument that you have a series of acts and omissions by the town which are interlocking, which created a lot of confusion? You had election inspectors, for instance, that didn't know going into the election day, who could vote and who couldn't vote as far as affidavit ballots were concerned. You have the circumstances regarding the count afterwards. I mean, is there a picture here where we can look at this record and say, listen, there are people involved in the town who, through machinations, set this up to make sure this referendum got defeated?
I think for sure there's a picture of a special election taking place in a town where in some voting, in some areas, there was perhaps confusion, for sure. But to make the leap that that was based upon some plan or some machinations by the administration to tip off one group as opposed to another group, as opposed to it just being the fact that there were election inspectors who perhaps weren't understanding what was happening, were not taking direction in some instances from the town clerk when he called. When he was called, they even presented an audio tape. I think it might even be a videotape, actually, of the clerk speaking to the Montebello election inspectors, explaining to them about, yes, unregistered voters were permitted to vote. He was taking phone calls the whole day telling people this. It was in the newspaper that morning. So I think the fact that there were certain places where there was a large turnout of people who wanted affidavit voting, frankly, is simply a product of certain groups getting the vote out better than other groups, and certain people being happier with the result as opposed to other groups not being happy with the result. I don't think there's certainly no evidence of that in the record of any other basis for it, and frankly, there's not even one affidavit, and Judge Garvey pointed out, not one affidavit after 1 year since the election of even one person, not even one person, who said that they did not vote in this election because they thought they could not vote. And that's not for the lack of trying, because frankly, appellants contacted the public with their social media and so on, soliciting such affidavits, and in fact put 20 affidavits.
That part of the record?
No.
Okay.
And in fact, put 20 affidavits into the record concerning poll workers and other people about other issues, largely hearsay, but other issues. But we're unable to secure even one affidavit from a person either saying that they did not vote because they thought that they couldn't, or from a person saying that any particular vote that was cast was an improper vote, and I understand now that Mr. Parietti is indicating that they're not challenging those votes.
All right, anything else?
None unless there are any other questions.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Rebuttal, Your Honor?
You may have heard the announcement at the beginning that we do not generally permit rebuttal arguments at these appeals. I did allow it on a habeas petition earlier today because that was that's a criminal matter, but the answer is no.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now I understand that our typed calendar